Today we have Mr. William Dalrymple here. He's an award-winning historian on Indian history. He's one of the best-known historians on Indian history and also a travel writer. He's written several best-selling books, such as The City of Jinns, which I have here, as well as Kohinoor, the world's most infamous diamond. So, Mr. Dalrymple, for our first question, you started off as a travel historian, and you've written several highly acclaimed historical books that have appealed to both scholarly circles and academics and ordinary people like me who are just, history buffs. People of my generation, Generation Z, the iPhone generation, are, however, increasingly gravitating towards shorter form content like TikTok or Instagram Reels, or in the case of travel, like travel vlogs. What would you say to them about picking up a 550-page book like The Anarchy or White Muggles?
Um, well, a couple of things. First of all, thank you for having me on. Very nice to be here, and very nice to see someone reading books and showing an interest in authors, which is great.
Thank
Um, so I mean, I've been all sorts of different things in my life, as I'm sure you will be, because as very few of us these days have one uh, course that we make all our life. I've been at different times. Before I was a travel writer, I was a foreign correspondent. I've been a feature writer on magazines. Uh, but really, since I started having kids 20 years ago and could travel far less, I've turned my attention to history, which was what I studied at college at Cambridge. And that's been my main focus. And I've just completed 4 books on the East India Company, which have now been put in a box set. Not oddly, for some reason in America, but everywhere else in the world, they're now available as a box called the Company Quartet, which tells the story of the founding, flourishing, growth, and eventual nationalization of the world's most violent and extractive multinational ever. That makes both the Medellin cartel and sort of Rio Tinto and all these other ExxonMobil look like benign and charming environmental movements compared to anything else. The East India Company was the first and most extraordinary multinational which conquered a lot of the world. It first conquered India, then it started growing opium there, sold the opium to China, bought the tea with the opium money, and it was East India Company tea which was dumped in Boston Harbor at the beginning of the American Revolution. So by this stage, this already by the 1780s, this multinational had fingers in every corner of the globe. And so, what Amazon is today, the East India Company was then, but with the difference that it had the largest army in Europe. It's 200,000 men, Indians, interesting. And that was one of the most extraordinary things about the East India Company, used Indian capital lent by Hindu and Jain bankers, and used it to purchase mercenary soldiers who were from UP and Bihar, and it was brown capital and brown soldiers that conquered India for the company. That's the most sinister aspect of all of it. That it was using Indians against Indians and using Indian money to subject India to British economic rule. Anyway, so all that has gone into these books, and you're right, they're big, fat, heavy books. But I have to say, I have not noticed that the generation which uses TikTok and Instagram has any problem at all with a fat book, as long as it's engaging and interesting. Your generation grew up on Harry Potter, and those books, are enormous fat books, but people read them even when they were 7, 8, 9, 10, because they were incredibly engaging, because they had characters, they had told stories, they were stories of good and bad, uh, evil and heroism, and just as in all ages, whether it's people gathered around a campfire or Indian sages telling the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, or whether it's watching Star Wars, these sort of movies and books and tales and oral histories attract people, and if they're well done, they will drag people in. And my aim as a historian has always been to try and aspire to the highest scholarly standards, but to tell stories with characters, which is what history is. It is a story. The story is there embedded in the name history, and there are many different ways to tell a history, in the same way that there are many ways to write a novel, and you wouldn't expect the same thing from, I don't know, a bodice ripping a section shopping novel as you would from War and Peace. There is, a huge amplitude of different ways of doing these things. And uh, I do not believe that there is, two worlds, one pop and the other scholarly, and that the two cannot meet. I think history is full of fascinating tales, and you can research them with great rigor, but tell them with great verve. And it's possible to do both. And that's what I aim to do in my books.
That's a really interesting answer. Yeah, and it makes like a lot more sense why, like how books can still survive in the short form content age. So yeah, you talked a lot about like your approach to writing.
I should also say that as well as doing the books, I do podcasts, like you do. And I have a podcast called Empire. That's one of the went straight to #1 on the British podcast charts when it opened, and it has more than a million downloads every month now. So it's these things can you can put these into different formats. It doesn't have to necessarily go in a 500-page book. And for anyone who is interested in the history of India, which is our first series, or the history of the Middle East, which was our second series, um, Empire Pod is available on Spotify or on Apple or any of the usual places, Google, any places you normally look for podcasts.
Right, everyone, check that out. Um, yeah, so I think it's really interesting the way you talk about your kind of approach to history and how you see it as like a storytelling form. And I think that's really interesting. What would you say, like, can you like describe to us what goes into writing one of your books, kind of from start to
Sure.
finish?
So, I mean, I'm not suggesting for a moment this is the way to write history, or the only way to write history, or even the best way to write history. This is how I write my history books. So take it or leave it. I normally take 4 or 5 years to write one of these books. The Company Quartet I began in 1999 and finished in 2019, so it is 20 years work, and so on average 4 years a book. First year, I'm normally finishing some other book and launching it, going around the world, giving lectures, and that's the time then I start reading the kind of existing literature on the subject. I mean, homing in on refining what I want to write about, and I will travel with my Kindle or with a pile of paperbacks and sit on the flights waiting for delayed aircraft or whatever it is, reading the stuff that's already published. Year two normally involves me going into the archives, and for the last 20 years for the East India Company, my main base has been the Indian National Archives in Delhi, which is, like everything in India, run by the government, difficult to access, frustrating at times, but ultimately if you jump through the hoops, it works. And it is, because it's so quite frustrating to get to, and because it's in Delhi rather than in London or New York, far fewer scholars work there, and there's a lot to be found as a result. So it's actually a very good place to be based if you're writing imperial history, or the history of these Indian companies I've been doing. And my 4 books have all been based really primarily on stuff I found in the Indian National Archives or in other archives around the place. The other thing that's very important is imperial history has generally been told from the British side, because the Brits, even as they were raping, looting, killing, plundering, asset stripping, and all the rest of it, kept records of everything, even the least flattering things of their record of what they were up to. And there are, however, very good Mughal records, and there is a very, very strong Indo-Islamic tradition of memoir and autobiography that starts with the Emperor Babur, who writes a memoir even as he's invading India. And many, many of these exist in Persian, which is a language virtually no one in India speaks anymore. It was the language of, just like French was the language of diplomacy across Europe and across Russia, and so everyone in Tolstoy novels is busy speaking French. So in medieval and early modern and up to about the mid-19th century India, Persian was the court language, used as much by Islamic sultans as it was by Shivaji, beginning of his career. And I worked for 20 years with a wonderful historian called Bruce Linnell, who was this sort of strange character who was very poor, never really held down a job, lived in council accommodation, but an enormously brilliant and stylish character who had perfect Persian. one of the great non-Persian speakers of Persian, and could read Mughal Persian as easily as you or I can read the New York Times. And he and I worked through a whole variety of previously unused Mughal sources, which in a sense I suspect is the probably most valuable thing that's emerged from these books. And they are equally reported in the eyes of Indian writers as they are in the eyes of the British. So year two is working through these sources, getting the stuff out of the archives. Year three is normally putting it all together. I have a date line, and I use old-fashioned card indexes, which I find a very useful way. You just bundle cards together, and I have 3 boxes: one for people, one for places, one for topics and events. And the cards grow, and by the time I come to write, there's normally 4 or 5 boxes full, and the date line can often be as much as 1,000 pages by the time I've come to write. With all that, so for everything that happens, there's a reference to whatever book or source or article and often if I've got the translation has been done by Bruce, I'll be shoving the translation in complete for each particular event. And then finally, for year 4 and 5 is putting it together. And if I've done my work and everything is nicely ordered and all the quotes are cut up into usable bits and so on, it shouldn't take too long. I've written books in as little as 5 months, and sometimes I mean, the longest is probably a year and a bit, but it doesn't take me more, and it shouldn't take more. I think writing, if you can write at white heat, you get much better narrative flow. And if you're stopping and starting and picking up and putting down and losing your thread, that's when you begin to lose the plot and get into tangles. And even when I'm not writing non-stop, I try and write each chapter non-stop. So, if I have to go off and, for example, I run the Jaipur Literature Festival, if I have to go off and do that, which normally takes, a full month of doing nothing else, I'll put the book down, put it to one side, wait until I've got time to really get into it again, and then pick it up afterwards and immerse myself fully. And the writing process is a bit like doing an exam. You do nothing else. You don't really go out. You don't go to bars. You don't have drinks with your friends. It's an austere period when you're locked up for the duration. But there's plenty, ample compensation in the launch period, which can take as long as a year, is the opposite. Virtually no work. It's just talking to people on Zoom or giving interviews or lectures, traveling, reading, and you're free at that time to go and sit by the pool or the ocean as much as you like, and between all these other things. But the period of writing is the opposite. It's the work. That's the rent you pay for all the other nice bits of this job.
Yeah, that's a very unique perspective on kind of writing, because what we see is just new book and nothing else. So yeah. So you said that living in Delhi gives you a kind of an advantage over other scholars looking to pursue Indian history because the best primary sources are located in Delhi. Is there anything else that prompted you to, live in South
Yeah,
Delhi?
I've lived here all my adult life. I love it. I should say I live here 9 months a year, which is important. I have a house in London, and I go back in the summer. And one of the great things about this is this mirror climate. So when London's cold and miserable, foggy and snowy in winter, I'm sitting hopefully on my terrace with parrots flying overhead and minor birds jumping up and down on my terrace uh, in the warmth. And this way, Delhi has a brief but cold winter that lasts from about mid-November to now to kind of beginning of February. And during that season, there's a little bit of cold. Otherwise, I mean, like you guys in the West Coast have a pretty good spread of sunshine throughout the year, which is nice. Good for my mood.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a million other reasons. The climate is important to me. I have to say, I do really like not being in British winters, but or Northern European winters. But and I just love this country. It's been very good to me. It's a fascinating place. It's often a frustrating place. It can be an irritating place, but it's never boring. It's always something weird going on. There's always something new. There's some aspect of culture or music or art or history or some weird religious ceremony or something happens almost every day. And I've been here, say, all my adult life, but it still baffles me, surprises me, inspires me. And it's, yeah, I mean, I have many friends who complain of writer's block or they don't know what the next book is. I could keep going here for several lifetimes and not run out of material. It's a wonderfully, it's like being a child in a sweet shop, being a writer in India.
It's really beautiful to kind of hear that. Like it was almost poetic to hear that, kind of like your love for India. Um, so I may be Indian, right, by descent, but you have seen much more of India than I have. You've lived there longer than I have. Yet in India, do you ever like do you ever feel like a foreigner because you didn't weren't born there?
Complicated question. I mean, it's not a um, unusual situation, and in a sense, in this globalized world, there are many people like me who started in one place where people have one particular skin color and end up in another where they have a different one. But the way the world works at the moment is mostly people, brown people going west rather than white people going east. It's the opposite, obviously, for much of colonial history. And I can never be an Indian. People take one look at me, and however good my Hindi is, however much I know the customs and the history and know how to behave according to the local ethics and morality and so on, I will never be Indian, and people will always regard me as a foreigner. On the other hand, being an insider outsider like I am is not a bad place to be as a writer. You're both observing something because one of the things that happens is that if you live in the same place all your life, you cease to notice anything. The world around you becomes kind of invisible because it's just ordinary. And in the position I am, I'm continually confronted by things that I don't know or don't understand, or things I thought I understand but turn out not to understand. And for a writer, that's stimulating. So it can be frustrating socially. Um, and I think my kids who grew up here probably find it even more so because, in a sense, they are even more invested in it than I am. And India is a huge, even bigger part of their identity, even though they look like white Scotsman or Scotswoman in the case of my daughter. Um, so, but in a sense, that's no different from a million Indians arriving in California or whatever. Many people today are not where they grew up or where they imagined they would be as children.
Yeah, like I live in America, right? And I was always taught to like regard myself as American and like yes, Indian American, but like you're American, right? Meanwhile, like in India, you are very acquainted with the history, culture, as you said, and yet you may not be regarded as Indian. Are people in India ever surprised that you know like this much about their countries, perhaps sometimes even more than them?
Irritatingly, I mean, it's one of the kind of boring things. People say, "God," whenever they read my books the first time. I don't know how you know so much about Indian history. Well, because I've been writing it for 25 years. It's not surprising I know a little bit about it. I'm not a moron. If I've been here 25 years writing history, of course I'm going to know this stuff. So yes, no, I mean, everyone is always surprised because they do not expect a white guy to live here. And often people are kind of assume there's some sort of dodgy or ulterior motive. What's he up to on that farm? Or something of that sort. Um, it's it is unusual. I mean, there are not many people that come to India, make their life here, and write about it. But it's a very nice life. I have to say, I like it very, very much. I mean, I could leave tomorrow if I didn't like it. Yeah, I mean, the only thing that the clouds in the horizon is I find that politically this is getting less and less easy pace for a writer to live. India has, I mean, this can be charted very obviously on India's place in the index of press freedom, which has gone down. I think there's 190 rankings, and India was 130, and it's now 150. So it's not one of the least tolerant places of critical journalism. The papers now almost all have fallen into line behind Modi and the BJP, and there's very thin skin here about criticism, and so I mean it's quite imaginable that in the course of time I won't be able to continue here, whether I won't be tolerated here or whether it just won't be an appropriate place to be able to write freely. Um, That said, this is also a place where the economy is booming now, and there's very high growth rate. Sorry, a very high rate of growth. And so I'm very uh, optimistic for India. Politically, less so.
Um, Actually, I had a question about that one I've been wanting to ask, and this is the perfect opportunity. So like as a historian, you may have like you've definitely seen like there are many people in India right now who are basically historical revisionists. They have an alternate version of history. Is there anything we can do as normal people, citizens, to kind of mitigate this historical revisionism without naming names about who's doing it?
So there's no harm in rewriting history per se. Every generation of historian does it. It's the job of historians to rewrite history. You do not. It's not your job to parrot what the previous generation of historians said. You should be looking at sources. You should be thinking about things. History changes in the light of the changing present. Things look different perspective. But such rewriting has to be based on fact. It can't be based on religious nationalism, on bigotry, on prejudice, on make believe. And So, on one hand, yes, you're right. There's an awful lot of. I mean, the simple reality is that India was a place where all the university departments were dominated by the left and often by Marxist historians. It's now a place where the BJP and the RSS are extremely popular, likely to be in power for the foreseeable future, and they are getting their men into all different university departments. So you're having now constant clashes in every university department, in every publishing house, with different visions of history. Now, in itself, there's no harm in having an orthodoxy challenged and having one dominant view challenged by another view. But when that orthodoxy is sort of rigorously enforced by a state and you are not free to write the truth as you see it, then things get into trouble. And we're walking somewhere along that line at the moment. At the moment, certainly in universities, there's a lot of vigorous resistance to the right-wing view of history. I mean, in many ways, it's quite a refreshing moment to be a historian because people are interested in history. There's lots of chat about it that ranges in quality from completely fictional WhatsApp forwards of a sort of bigoted Islamophobic nature, which go whizzing round, and occasionally I get to see. But also, newspapers, magazines, people like you are interested in learning what the truth is, and so it's not a bad moment to be having strong views about history and to be able to back it up with facts and research. So, I mean, we're not yet in a world where historians cannot say the truth, where there is a party line that you have to follow. It's heading in that direction, but we aren't there yet. And I hope that India is as sufficiently loud, clamorous, diverse, and argumentative place for any strong imposition of one view to be impossible.
Are there any lessons to be learned from past like surges in religious fervor identitarianism?
Yes, I mean the simple fact that there are waves of these things. There are periods of left and dominance and right dominance. You see it in British history too, and that they pass. But often these things go in decade-long cycles. So I don't think we're at peak Modi yet. I think there'll be more to come before it goes into decline, particularly as there's no opposition. Rahul Gandhi is a washout, and the opposition haven't got their act together. So I think we're stuck with this government for better or worse for the foreseeable future. The question is whether this government, I mean, there are many grown up and sensible voices in and around this government. The question is whether they win out or whether you get the real out and out head banging nutcases, of whom there's also quite a few around. Not naming any names.
Yeah. Okay, so switching gears, from the present to the past, in your latest work, or I should really say your life's work in the company quartet, the latest one, in the Anarchy, you talk of a chaotic time and how like the takeover of the East India Company was essentially a chaotic event. Right. So I was born here in the US, and we Americans learn about, well, now we learn about our history of sending over companies to take over other places. For example, the Dole Pineapple Company in Hawaii or the banana companies in Central America. Are there any lessons to be learned both from the past and in the present about the rise of the East India Company in particular and how they took control of Indian
Sure.
subsidiaries?
I mean, that's the whole point of the enterprise, really, is that yes, there are many, many lessons to be learned, and this is not new. And so it's a mistake, I think, to believe, as the Victorians believed, in the 19th century tended to believe, that all power and all history is the reserve of the state. Uh, Corporations, as we know, can be very, very powerful too. And you're sitting in California, and around you, literally in the 20-mile radius of where you're sitting, are these vast companies like Hewlett Packard, Apple, and Microsoft. Huge enclosures as you leave the airport. And these companies have vast global reach, and they have turnovers bigger than most of the countries in the world. Apple alone has a bigger turnover than all the nations in sub-Saharan Africa. And that means that these companies are extremely powerful. It doesn't mean that they are necessarily evil empires run by Lord Voldemort, but they are potentially centers of power that can rival the state, and in many parts of the world are more powerful than the state. The history of these India companies shows that corporations have a great deal of power that they can exert in a variety of ways. The East India Company most obviously exerted it in a military fashion, which is not likely to happen with most of these corporations. Even Elon Musk, with all his cash, has possibly space rockets, but doesn't have intercontinental ballistic missiles yet, um, and is unlikely to any time soon. But there's data harvesting going on. Different data companies are listening to what we're saying, noting products and tendencies we have in our social media or online life, and they are very, very, very powerful. And so the East India Company shows that corporations can bribe politicians, can lead to the collapse of governments. There are many examples in recent history, whether it's the Anglo-Persian Oil Company bringing down the democratic government of Mossadegh in Iran, or you mentioned, I think, United Fruit in Guatemala bringing down the famous Banana Republic coup, or ITT bringing down Salvador Allende in Chile and with the CIA-backed coup, and bringing in a nasty right-wing junta, deemed to be more open to American economic interests. The whole question of whether ExxonMobil and the oil lobby here had any influence on the invasion of Iraq. We now know Iraq had absolutely nothing to do with the 9/11. Why was it invaded? Was it oil? What was it? Was it Israel? What were the factors involved? So all these things show that the threat of corporate influence is far from over. That corporates are an extremely powerful force in life, not necessarily all bad. They provide employment, they generate wealth. We all want a job, we all want money in our bank accounts, but they are things that the state needs to monitor and to keep an eye on. So I think it's a very important lesson from history about the power of corporations, and that's really the reason I wrote it. In the last 20 years, while I've been doing these books, it's very interesting. Both the study of colonialism and the study of the power of corporations has grown. And so this, in a sense, what was a slightly sort of fringe subject 20 years ago now actually feels as something very important. It's a real living lesson from the past about how our freedoms can be trampled under by a joint stock company. Something publicly listed on the stock exchange can gobble us up, destroy our house, invade our space, sell us products we don't want, spy on us, all these things, invade our country. And these are all possibilities. So it's, this is exactly why I would like people to read this book and listen to my Empire podcast.
And I agree. Yeah, no, that is harrowing to think about, but yeah, but that just makes knowing history all the more important.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about like any like new project that you're working on, or is it top secret?
Not at all. No, I've never been able to keep secrets in general, and certainly not my books. So my new book is called The Golden Road. It is half written, just past the halfway point, actually. I'm going to be reading through chapter 5 out of 9 chapters when I put this Zoom call to bed or turn it off. And it is the story of, it's a very different book to the Company Quartet. Company Quartet is now signed, sealed, packaged, boxed, marketed, out of my life. This is a story of an earlier phase of Indian history, and the period when Indian influence was dominant in Asia. And it's the story of how Indian ideas such as Buddhism went to China. Other Indian ideas such as Hinduism went to Southeast Asia, leading to the creation of Angkor Wat, the largest Hindu temple in the world, not in India, but in Southeast Asia. And how Indian mathematics, numbers, and astronomy went westwards to Baghdad, and from Baghdad on into Europe, so that the numbers we use today have Indian origin. So it's the story of Indian maths going westwards is the third part of the book. So that should be out, I hope, by October. I hope to be finishing it by June. Let's say just beyond the halfway point, heading for 2/3, and I hope to get it done by June and out by October with any luck.
Great. Yeah, no, we will be on the lookout for that. So this has been Mr. William Dalrymple, famous historian. Thank you so much for talking with us.
It's been really nice talking.